Senator John Kennedy did something unusual. He told his colleagues the January 6 questioning was a political trap. Then he asked the nominee the same hard question himself. Why sign the Columbia letter as a sitting federal judge? His verdict: the federal judiciary has lost some of its legitimacy. Watch the exchange first, then we'll step back and unpack what it really tells us.
I think we ought to clear the air here. We all know what's going on. President Trump believes passionately that he won the 2020 election. And you're being asked these questions in hopes you will say that he didn't. Or in hopes that you will say that he did. Regardless of what you actually think, the further hope is that it'll cause the president to twist off and pull your nomination. And that's what's going on here. I'm not saying my good friend doesn't have the right to do that. Some would say it's kind of clever, but I don't think we ought to kid ourselves about what's going on. Number two, my job, I don't, this business of confirming judges has become too much of a shirts versus skins game for my taste. If I could change it, I would, but I can't. Picking somebody for the federal bench is as serious as 4 heart attacks and a stroke. You're there for life. We better get it right. And my job is to be as I see it, is to be an equal opportunity antagonist. Now, some would use another A word to describe me. And I realize that. But that's my job. And the two biggest things going for you, Judge, I don't know. You have read your resume, it's impressive. Or John Hoeven and Kevin Kramer. If they tell me you ought to be on the Court of Appeal, I believe them. Because they understand the role of a United States Senator. There are a couple of questions I want to ask you. Why did you? I heard your answer to Senator Durbin, but you were a sitting federal judge, and I know some other judges joined you, but you wrote a letter to Columbia saying, because of what I see happening at Columbia, I'll never hire one of your graduates. Why did you do that?
Senator, I was asked to sign the letter. It was indicated over a period of time, and the reason why is because it wasn't simply a student protest that was occurring. It was a protest that was resulting in violent conduct.
Well, I know what happened. I guess what I'm getting at is our federal judiciary has lost some of its legitimacy. I'm not laying it at your doorstep, but it has. And so many Americans now feel, because they're told, that judges are just politicians in robes. Okay? They're just mini legislatures. And that's not what our founders intended, and I don't think that's what they are. And so when a federal judge expresses a political opinion like you did and your colleagues did, how does that help our effort to help the public understand that judges aren't politicians?
Senator, I've been told a lot that federal judges have a lot of power, and you've said it, I think, in other hearings and contexts. But our power is limited. It's significantly limited to the case or controversy before us. We don't have the power of an executive. We don't even have the power to change laws like you do. as a legislator.
I get that, Judge, and you're a judge. You can do what you want. I hope you won't do something like that again. I'm not saying you don't have the right, but when you adopt a political position, which I happen to believe with, frankly, to do that as a private lawyer is one thing. To do it as a sitting federal judge is quite another. And I just don't think it's a good thing. That's my personal opinion. You don't tweet anymore, do you?
I do not.
Okay. You don't go on social media at all?
I go on social media to follow other people, including...
Sure, but not to post.
Not at all. In fact, I think I know the name of your elliptical.
Yeah. Margaret and I had a date Sunday night. She won.
In the carport.
In my carport. She won. Thank you. I'm over. I'm sorry, Mr. Chairman.
What made this exchange unusual is that Senator John Kennedy of Louisiana opened by naming the political game in the room, and then proceeded to ask the same hard question himself. He told the committee plainly that the January 6th line of questioning was a trap. The hope, he said, was that the nominee would say something the president did not want to hear, or that the president would react badly and pull the nomination. Kennedy did not defend the trap. He just put it on the record and moved on. Then he turned to the substantive question that has shadowed this nomination from the start. Why did the nominee sign the public Columbia letter as a sitting federal judge? Kennedy described the modern confirmation process as a shirts versus skins game and said he wished he could change it but could not. That line is worth pausing on. It is the chairman of the Senate Judiciary Committee acknowledging that the confirmation of federal judges, the most consequential lifetime appointments the Senate makes, has degraded into a partisan team sport. He did not blame his Democratic colleagues alone. He did not blame his Republican colleagues alone. He blamed the system. That framing matters. It is the rare moment when a senior member of the body that runs the process publicly states that the process is not working the way the Constitution intends. Kennedy then named his own approach to the hearing in advance. He said his job is to be an equal opportunity antagonist. He noted, with characteristic self-deprecation, that some would use a different word to describe him. That is a real disclosure to a nominee. It signals that the questions that come next are not partisan questions. They are the same questions Kennedy asks every nominee in every administration. When a senator names that posture out loud, it usually means the nominee should brace for an uncomfortable round. That is what came next. Kennedy used one of his trademark lines to set the stake. Picking somebody for the federal bench, he said, is as serious as 4 heart attacks and a stroke. The seat is for life. The Senate has to get it right. The line is jocular in delivery, but the message is straight. A confirmation vote is one of the few decisions a senator makes that cannot be revisited. Once a federal judge is on the bench, the only remedy is impeachment, which is exceedingly rare. The seriousness of the vote is what Kennedy was anchoring before he asked the question that the public watching at home was waiting for. Kennedy then turned to the Columbia letter. The nominee had co-signed a public letter to the president of Columbia University, committing not to hire law clerks from the Columbia graduating class beginning in 2024. Kennedy referenced the nominee's earlier answer to Senator Durbin. He noted that other federal judges had also signed the letter. Then he asked the question, "Why did you do that?" The question is identical in substance to the question Skiff and Durbin had asked earlier from the other side of the aisle. The fact that Kennedy asked the same question, in his own voice from his own party, is what makes the exchange land. The nominee's answer to Kennedy was the same answer he had given Durbin earlier. He explained that he was asked to sign the letter, that the situation on the Columbia campus was not simply a student protest, but a protest that he and the other signatories believed involved violent conduct toward Jewish students and others. The framing locates the letter as a response to a specific situation rather than a political statement. The nominee did not retreat from the letter. He defended the choice to sign it as a moral response to what he saw as a campus safety crisis. Kennedy then made the most important statement of the exchange. The federal judiciary, he said, has lost some of its legitimacy. He was careful to note that he was not laying that loss at the nominee's doorstep alone. But he said the public increasingly believes that judges are politicians in robes. That is not a partisan grievance. It is a widely shared concern across the political spectrum. Public opinion data on confidence in the federal judiciary has trended downward for years. Kennedy was naming the trend, on the record, in a confirmation hearing. That is the kind of statement that ends up in law review articles 5 years later. Politicians in robes is a phrase that has become shorthand for the loss of public confidence in the judiciary. It is a phrase used by critics on the left and on the right, often about different judges. Kennedy used it in his own framing rather than as a quote. When the Republican chairman of the Senate Judiciary Committee tells a Republican-supported nominee that the public sees federal judges as politicians in robes, the framing carries weight. It is the kind of cross-partisan acknowledgement that bipartisan judicial reform conversations tend to start from. Whether that conversation will happen is a separate question. The framing is now on the record. Kennedy then asked his pointed question. When a federal judge expresses a political opinion of the kind the nominee and his colleagues did, in writing, in a public letter to Colombia's president, how does that help the broader effort to convince the public that judges are not politicians? The question does not assume the nominee was wrong about Colombia. It asks the nominee to step back and consider whether the public letter, however well-intentioned, made the broader public confidence problem better or worse. That is a thoughtful question. It is the kind of question that nominees rarely get from members of their own party. The nominee answered by minimizing the scope of judicial power. He noted that federal judges are limited to the cases or controversies before them. They cannot make executive decisions. They cannot pass laws. Their authority is specific, episodic, and reactive. The framing is technically correct in the constitutional sense. It is also the standard answer judges give when asked about public engagement on policy questions. Kennedy heard the answer and accepted it as the nominee's view. He did not press further on the doctrine. He pressed instead on the personal preference. Kennedy's closing line to the nominee on the Columbia letter was simple and direct. "I hope you will not do something like that again." He acknowledged that the nominee had the right to do it. He acknowledged that doing it as a private lawyer would have been different from doing it as a sitting federal judge. But he expressed the personal preference clearly. Doing it as a sitting federal judge is, in his view, not a good thing. The phrase was conversational rather than confrontational. The substance was unmistakable. A Republican senator on the Judiciary Committee was telling a Republican-supported nominee, on the record, that he should not have done what he did. This exchange landed differently than the earlier Skiff and Durbin exchanges because of the messenger. The Skiff and Durbin questions could be dismissed by sympathetic observers as partisan opposition research. The Kennedy questions could not. Kennedy is a Republican from Louisiana whose voting record is firmly aligned with the administration that nominated the judge. When Kennedy independently arrives at the same critique that the Democratic minority arrived at, the critique stops being a partisan question. It becomes a structural question about judicial conduct. That shift is what made this exchange meaningful for the larger confirmation conversation. Kennedy drew the same line that the formal judicial canons draw. As a private lawyer, signing a public letter to a university president takes the same legal posture as any other public statement by a private citizen. As a sitting federal judge, the same letter takes on a different character. The canons of judicial conduct, the Code of Conduct for United States judges, and decades of judicial ethics commentary all bend around that distinction. Kennedy did not need to cite the canons to make the point. He just stated the distinction in plain language. The nominee did not push back on the distinction itself. The disagreement was about whether the specific letter crossed it. Kennedy then made a quick pivot to social media. He asked whether the nominee still tweets. The nominee said no, he had stopped. Kennedy asked whether the nominee posts on any social media at all. The nominee said he uses social media only to follow others, not to post. That sequence is a standard part of modern judicial confirmation. The expectation across the federal bench has hardened over the past decade. Sitting federal judges do not typically maintain active public social media presences. The nominee's answer placed him in line with that consensus. Kennedy registered the answer and used a light personal anecdote to close out the round. Kennedy closed his time with a brief personal note about his wife Margaret and a date in the carport on Sunday night. It is the kind of closing line Kennedy is known for. The substance is light. The function is to humanize the round and signal to the nominee that the questioning is over without animus. That is a deliberate choice. Senators who want to leave room for a nominee they have just challenged often close on a personal note. It signals that the substantive questions were not personal, the function is institutional, the form is informal, Kennedy executed it cleanly. Step back from the personalities and look at the broader pattern. The Columbia letter question has now been raised by 3 senators from across the political spectrum. Senator Schiff raised it from the structural inconsistency angle. Senator Durbin raised it as a side-by-side written contradiction. Senator Kennedy raised it as a judicial legitimacy concern. The underlying question across all 3 angles is the same. Should sitting federal judges co-sign public letters that take positions on contested institutions in the middle of active litigation? The hearing record now contains 3 different framings of that question and 3 different responses from the nominee. Future committees will read all 3 together. Cross-partisan critique on judicial conduct is rare in confirmation hearings. The norm is that the majority party defends and the minority party attacks. When a chairman from the majority party independently raises the same concern the minority party has raised, the moment usually becomes a teaching case for future judicial ethics conversations. This Kennedy exchange will likely be one of those teaching cases. Law review articles will cite it. Bar Association committees writing on judicial conduct will reference it. Future nominees preparing for hearings will study it. The exchange did not flip Kennedy's vote. The vote outcome was unlikely to change either way. What the exchange did was put the structural question on the record in a posture that is harder for future judges to ignore. Give both sides their due. Senator Kennedy used the hearing format the way it is meant to be used. He spoke his concern about judicial legitimacy directly and without anger. He named the political game in the room without blaming any single party for it. He drew the line between private and judicial speech. He registered his preference clearly. The nominee defended his record on its own terms. The Columbia letter was a response to a specific situation. Judicial power is limited to case or controversy. Public engagement by a sitting judge is constrained but not eliminated. Neither side conceded ground. The transcript holds both. That is the format working properly. Hearing transcripts on judicial confirmations are read for decades. They become part of the standard literature on judicial conduct, on the confirmation process itself, and on the broader question of public confidence in the federal courts. The Kennedy portion of this transcript will be cited because it is unusual. A senior chairman from the majority party publicly stating that the judiciary has lost some of its legitimacy, and that sitting judges should not co-sign public letters of the Columbia kind, is the sort of statement that historians use to mark inflection points. Whether this hearing turns out to be an inflection point in practice will depend on what future judges and future committees do. The marker is on the record either way. So the final accountability question is the standard one. What was gained, what was lost, and who is paying the cost? The gain is a cross-partisan moment on the record about judicial legitimacy. The cost, depending on perspective, is a confirmation hearing that did not yield the easy partisan story either side might have preferred. The bench will get a new judge in due course. The Senate will move on to the next nominee. The harder question, which Kennedy named and did not solve, is what the federal judiciary will do to rebuild the public confidence that he says it has lost. That is a project that runs longer than any single confirmation vote. The committee did its part to put the question on the record. The rest belongs to the bench, the bar, and the public watching.